This is continuous coverage.
Continuous coverage.
In the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell from the Hidden Killers podcast.
Hidden Killers podcast.
That it is, and all this weekend, we are playing back for you some of the most intriguing interviews and conversations that we've had about this case, as well as relevant audio, including interrogation audio from Lori Daybell and many others involved in this case. Full trial coverage starts Monday. For now, take a listen back.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers podcast.
The Hidden Killers podcast.
With Tony Bruschi.
That it is. We're talking with Scott Roeder of Evidence Room today about the Daybells, about the evidence in the case against Lori Daybell and Chad Daybell. Lori getting her time in court. Jury selection underway as the moment we are recording this trial about to start. And, of course, we're reporting on that on the ground with our correspondent, Lauren Matthias. I want to talk about, with you, Scott, the evidence, about specifically the bodies. And there's a lot of bodies surrounding Chad and Lori Daybell, but specifically the children that were buried in the backyard of Chad Daybell's home. And in many accounts, not in, they weren't just like buried. They were dismembered. They were in pieces. And I'm not trying to be gross here. But the fact that existed, or that they existed like that, and they were buried for quite some time before they were actually unearthed. What can that tell us? What kind of evidence can be brought out of a body like that in terms of pointing a finger of guilt at someone or multiple people, or as time goes on, other than the fact that they found the bodies, is there much that can be garnered from that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Tony. This case, the body was so decomposed that really it's just going to be the identification of the body. Now, like in other cases where you have a buried body, like in the case of the kid that got hit down there in South Carolina, post-mortem, after such large amounts of decay of the tissue, really doesn't give you any indication. You will have some indications as to fractures. So they're going to be looking for fractures in the skull. They're going to be looking for fractures on any of the major extremities. That'll give you an indication of potential cause of death, especially any kind of a skull fracture or jaw fracture, missing teeth, things like that. From a biological standpoint, there's not going to be a whole lot of biology per se left to have a digital analysis of. So I think it's going to be trying to determine not necessarily time of death down to the day, but we might be able to get time of death down to a week or so relative to how decomposed the body was relative to the child being gone missing or last verifiably seen. So I think that's what they're going to be looking for, is indications on the time of when the body was buried and indication of any major fractures that could lead an investigator to believe there could have been a blunt impact force to incapacitate the child.
Because the belief is that one of the children died a little bit before the other. The exact window, roughly around a month or so, is what we've seen. Is that, and obviously these are estimates, I'm curious how much or how accurate can we get on that? Like you were talking about with determining time of death down to like a week. How accurate is that typically?
Well, it's really tough. All I can do is tell you about my previous experience working with these kinds of cases. I worked on a case with a Marine out of Fort, I won't say where, that had gone missing and ultimately had been discovered 6 weeks later in the brush near the military base. And he was so decomposed that and there was still tissue left on that body because it wasn't buried beneath the ground. it was buried. He was buried, I should say, above, not buried, but just above the ground, exposed to the elements, the heat and rain and so on. And that will accelerate the decomposition. So even in that case where it was just 6 weeks, it was very difficult to get the timing down as to, when this could have happened. But what it does do is it gives you a window of, well, when was, in my case I worked on, it was an adult. So there was a footprint that you could see went dark after a period of time. With a child, they're not going to have that footprint because they're not going to be using credit cards and bank statements and paying, bills and so on and so forth, right? So you don't have a big footprint except for, well, when was that child expected to be in school or daycare, or when was the last time that child was seen on a photograph or in a video or with a friend or a neighbor. That's really going to be, I think, more indicative as to, exactly when the child might have died. It's tough though. It all depends on the environment. A body found in cold weather is going to decompose a whole lot slower than a body found in, say, Texas. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, this is a cold weather area that they live in, I believe. At least they have, relatively colder climate. So in Idaho. Yeah. So I think, that could mean that there's a lot of tissue left on the remains to do analysis on potentially poison and things like that. Like I said, it's all going to be based on the kind of decomposition that's at hand. And depending on how much tissue and remains are available and what condition they're in is going to indicate what you can do and what you can't do.
Is there kind of an expiration? Obviously, the sooner you can get to a body, the better. I think that's easily understandable to try and determine some of these things. Is there essentially an expiration, though, on certain things as far as trying to figure out poison? Blunt force trauma can tell you kind of one thing, although I suppose if the body is dismembered, that may be a little more difficult to determine what happened when. But is there an expiration essentially on when one could detect some of these things, from poison to other causes of death?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great question. Well, when we're talking about poisons, the number one organ or body part that you're going to need to be able to analyze is the liver and the kidneys. Obviously the stomach as well, because if it's an ingested poison, there will be traces of it on the stomach. If it's been processed, you're going to have that poisons go into the liver. The liver is the part of your body that's the garbage can of the human body. That's where all toxins get processed, and that's why if you have liver failure, unless you have a liver transplant, your days are numbered. So the liver is critical, but that's also extremely soft tissue that lies not that deep beneath the layers of skin. And if you have a body out there for a year, I think it's real dicey on whether or not you're going to get valuable tissue from the liver, or if the liver's even going to be there. It all depends on really gross things like how the body was wrapped, if the body was clothed, if the body had a lot of fatty tissue, what the weather was like, how deep the body was buried. But the liver is going to be the thing you're going to want to look at. It's hard to say on timing. Like I said, it's going to be all about so many variables on whether or not the body was going to have any level of preservation. But if it's poison, they're going to be looking for traces of it in the liver, no doubt.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
The Hidden Killers Podcast.
With Tony Bruschi.
Scott Roeder of Evidence Room, and he has his podcast, Crime Scene Time Machine, exclusively on Spotify. Please do check that out. I'm Tony Bruschi. You can follow me on Twitter at TonyBPod. We have a lot more to come. Stay with us.